Guten Morgen an alle Teilnehmerinnen und Teilnehmer unseres heutigen Webinars. Vielen Dank, dass Sie heute da sind. Mein Name ist Uwe Hering, Marketing Programs Manager bei InterSystems in Darmstadt. Und ich werde Sie als Moderator durch dieses spannende Webinar führen. Der heutige Webcast unserer Webinarreihe InterSystems TechTalk beschäftigt sich mit der wichtigen Frage, wie Webanwendungen abgesichert werden können. Dabei wird es vor allem darum gehen, wie sich Webanwendungen vor unberechtigten Zugriffsversuchen schützen lassen. Der Titel des heutigen Webinars lautet demgemäß Sicherheit und Autorisierung für Webanwendungen OAuth 2.0 mit InterSystems Iris. Shubham Sumalya wird uns in die Welt von OAuth 2.0 einführen und außerdem darüber sprechen, wie Autorisierungen auch über Drittanbieter realisiert werden können. Bevor ich Shubham gleich das Wort übergebe, noch ein kurzer Hinweis. Shubham ist kein Deutsch-Muttersprachler. Er lernt sehr, sehr fleißig Deutsch und ist auch schon sehr, sehr weit gekommen. Für dieses Webinar haben wir uns aber entschieden, dass er es doch noch einmal auf Englisch durchführen wird. Sie können aber Ihre Fragen jederzeit auch auf Deutsch stellen. Hallo Shubham, Webanwendungen sind naturgemäß besonders lohnende Angriffsziele für Hacker und Kriminelle, denn sie sind ganz einfach aus dem Internet zu erreichen. Wo und wie ordnet sich denn das Thema Authentifizierung in diesen Kontext ein?
Welcome, everyone. Uwe, you asked the right question. It's important that once we have our web application ready, that we also look for the security measures that will control the access to the right entity, be it a person or another application. Also, we have to look into the scenario when a person is allowed to access the data, but not all of it. That's why we need an identity and access management system in place, and we'll talk about it today. Today, we'll start with the place where we left last time. In our last webinar, we discussed about how to create REST APIs with the help of Iris. Today, we'll discuss how to secure this endpoint with a delegated authorization process, and also by a third-party identity and access management provider. To our viewers who are less familiar with the topic of how to create a REST API, I would suggest you to watch the previous video. The YouTube link will be posted in the video description later. Having said that, everyone can follow today's webinar and benefit from it because we'll talk about the process and architectural and communication flow of OAuth 2.0, which has very less dependencies on the Iris side. Ja, Uwe.
Danke, Shubham. Das war ja schon eine sehr ausführliche Antwort auf eine, wie ich fand, sehr kurze Frage. Danke dafür. Bevor es nun dann gleich losgeht, wie immer noch einige logistische Aspekte. Wie immer haben wir sie nämlich stumm geschaltet, um den Ablauf des Webinars nicht zu stören. Sie können jederzeit Ihre Fragen in das Q&A oder Fragen- und Antwort-Widget eingeben, das sich zum Start des Webinars rechts neben dem Fenster mit den PowerPoint-Folien befinden sollte. Am Ende des Webinars werden wir dann wie gewohnt auf diese Fragen eingehen. Und auch wenn Sie technische Probleme haben, steht Ihnen die Q&A-Funktion jederzeit zur Verfügung. Damit dann auch genug der Vorrede. Shubham, bitte leg los.
So, meet Marla. She's the proud owner of her company's web application, which we created in the last session. We used Iris to create REST application for her that when receives request for the list of cars that Marla's company has to offer, returns the car details in response. That's not easy. Marla has two problems. The first one is that she wants to secure the REST endpoint behind an authorization and authentication system. She wants her employees to authenticate themselves with credentials provided to them from Marla's company. Basically, employees get the ownership or access of the resources restricted behind the endpoint by authenticating them. And the second problem she has is that she does not want to create and manage credentials and access rights of the employees. Using Iris. She wants to rather use a third-party authenticating service to manage the identity and access rights of her employees. Then, all right. So Marla went outside to explore her options, and she found plenty of them. For example, she found Azure from Microsoft, and then some Google and AWS services that she could choose from as her identity and access management service. Then she decided, okay, let's go with Azure from Microsoft. So she met the Azure guy and asked her, hey, I want to secure my REST endpoints. Would you be my authorization server? And my employees would authenticate themselves in front of your software. And once they're authenticated, they'll get an access to my resources or company data. And now that Marla has an agreement and a deal with the Azure guy, Marla went ahead to hire her new employee and told him that you're gonna receive credentials from Microsoft and you would use those credentials to log in and access our our company's confidential data. So let's see what will the user experience when he goes to the company's website to access the card data. The user will go to the client or company's website to log in. The browser takes the user to the authorization server's login page. The user gets the access of the resources from the resource server after he correctly provides his login credentials to Azure. But how did this happen? Let's go back to the conversation of Marla and the Azure guy. What details did the Azure guy reply to Marla when Marla had asked for the service at the first place? Marla says to the Azure guy, now that I've told you my requirements and you have shown that you have an ability to provide this service to me, I guess your identity and access management service for my employees will be up and running by the end of the day. The Azure guy said, I understand that you want this functionality to be all set up and running as soon as possible, but it's not that simple. First thing first is that you will have to introduce all of the participating parties to Azure, and they will get certain set of identification or credentials from us so that when they try to access something, we'll know who they are and what they want, and should they be given what they want. And then the Azure guy adds, that's just the tip of the iceberg. We'll need to follow certain rules and methods to carry the authorization process. That means we cannot just randomly start asking for the access. There is a disciplined and step-by-step process to follow. Marla says, okay, then what are the rules or the discipline to do this? Who will give that? Azure guy says, that's OAuth 2.0. It is protocol drafted by IETF, or Internet Engineering Task Force. So this is the entire flow that actually takes place when you follow OAuth 2.0 protocol. There are many parties involved, as you can see on the top. You have the user or the resource owner who actually wants to empower the client app, our website, or a tool such as Postman, to bring the resource or the data from the resource server. The next is the user agent, which is the browser, where all the fetching of connections and websites takes place. And then the auth server, which is Microsoft's Azure service. It is called as Entra ID. And the receiver here is InterSystems Iris, which actually protects our data. So how does it work? The user goes to a browser and enters a URL, let's say www.enterprise.com, in our case, our website. And then the browser brings user to the URL or the website or the client app, let's say, and then tries to sign in there. But the client app, because it trusts the auth server and wants the user to be authenticated by auth server, redirects the user to the auth URL, which is given by the auth server. An auth server now presents an UI where user can actually enter his credentials, like username and password. Once this data is submitted, it goes back to the auth server, and auth server, after authenticating it, provides an auth authorization code to the browser. Now, this eventually, this authorization code reaches to the client, and client takes this authorization code plus client secret. Client secret is something which we will see later, how we have it. But for now, let's understand that client secret is basically the stamp of trust, what auth server does on any entity. So the client app gets a client secret from auth server. And when the client app receives the auth code in the first part of the process, it uses this authorization code and the client secret, what it has, to again contact auth server. And then auth server provides an access token to the client in response. This access token now has the ability to empower the client app here, be it Postman or our website, to go to the resource server and access the confidential data of user or the resource owner on his behalf. And this access token so reaches to Iris in our case, and it goes through certain steps and procedure to be validated. And then once the token is valid and all the parameters are matched, how Iris was expecting it to be, then the protected resource is sent back to the client, which then client shows to the user. And I have prepared exactly the same scenario what you saw in the last slide about the communication flow in OAuth 2.0 with different actors involved there in a demo, and we'll quickly see the steps of how one can connect their Microsoft Entra ID to authenticate and authorize users to basically access data which is otherwise protected by our resource server, which is Iris. So let's see what are the fundamental steps that one needs to do, what are the checklists, and how the whole communication actually takes place when you start uh, connecting or implementing a project like this. The management portal and going to our web application car rentals and removing the unauthenticated to delegated in the security settings, and then we save it. And then we go to our Entra ID on Azure. We could create this Entra ID from here. I mean, for example, go in the resource and type Entra ID and then select Entra ID, and then you can see that there is one here to be ready to be created. You could create that, but I've already created one for me. And you can see here that I can go inside it and I can see that there are 4 users here, which I have defined with their credentials and some applications here. There are 5 of them, which I've registered to our Enter ID. One can go on the Add button and create new user or do an app registration. You can put a name here and then also select the redirect URI, where basically your access token is sent back. In the applications, here you can see that there are 5 of them, but library API and Postman client, these 2 are relevant for this example because Postman client is the app registration for my Postman tool. You have an ID here, client ID, and you can see that there are secrets. One is expired, but I made another secret here, and it has a secret ID and value. The value matters. You can create as many client secrets you want. The value gets hidden after a certain point, so it's important that you save the value and use this as the client secret in your application configurations. The second one is library API. This basically represents the resource server on Iris. It also has a client ID, and you can see here is a secret, which is also now hidden. So those are the settings. Also, you can see that in library API, we have defined application ID URI, which is basically a scope. The scope is custom made by us. You can add a new one, adding this, clicking on this button. And this will basically give the idea to the Azure and the other actors involved that for which application we are trying to access the resources. Now, what you're seeing here is Postman. Here, you can see that if I choose a no auth authorization mechanism, I don't get any parameters to feed in. If I use basic auth, then you will see that it asks for simple username and password. And if you go to OAuth 2.0, then there are a set of details, what it needs for you to configure there. And the one thing what you can see here is that once you have done all those details, then you can click on Get New Access Token. And using these details, Postman sends a request to Azure and gets an access token. So here there are different grant types. We'll use authorization code grant types. And here is a callback URL, which you would provide to Azure to send the access token and the user back to this link, because once the user is authenticated, there should be an address where the values or the access token would be sent back. And you can see here that in the Postman client, here, I've defined a redirect URI. And this redirect URI is exactly what I've mentioned also in the Postman, so that Azure knows after the token is returned, where should the control move to. So that's the callback URL. It's needed for the client. And then we have authorization URL. This should be a link from where the authorization in Azure will be performed. And you can see in the endpoints in Azure, there are many endpoints which show different links which you could use in your code to basically contact Azure for different purposes. Like you have authorization endpoint, you have token endpoint, and so on. So this one here is the authorization endpoint. You can copy this and go back to Postman and put it there. And yeah, and then you have also this access token URL. which is also obtained from the same endpoint list here. Take care of the version here. It should be v2. We are using version 2 here. So you could use this, copy this link and put it here. And then you have client ID and client secret. And these client ID and client secrets are for Postman. For Postman to basically identify itself at Azure. So this is here what you see client ID, and I already showed to you that here you find your client secret. Once these two are given here, then we look for scope. And now scope is something where we are defining what kind of access of what resource we want to access from Iris, right? So this has to be all about the place where we want to go and access some data. And how are we defining this? Because we have also registered a Iris resource server in the Azure, this particular string defines the client ID of that particular actor, or the resource server in our case, this library API. So you can see that the client ID here is exactly what I've asked for. And here is the complete string for the scope, what I've defined. So I've defined here a scope saying scope 2. This means this can mean anything, which we have to consider later. But here we are explaining that we want to go to a library API and look for a particular data, and this is my scope. Now, in the end, we say get new access token, and I proceed with this new token. And here you did not see a login screen because it was saved in cookies. I could clear cookies here. And then if I go and try for a new access token from Azure, then you will see a login screen popping up here. And remember, we had defined some users. So you will get your credentials from Microsoft, and that's what you put here. Putting my InterSystems account details here. And because multi-factor authorization is enabled, I'll have to switch to my authenticator app and probably sign in from there. Maybe once more, I have to use my authenticator app to authorize it. And you'll see once this process is done, Azure sends an access token for us to use, or to take this and go now to our resource server in Iris to access the data of get all cards. Now let's see what we have to do on the Iris end. We'll go to security and OAuth 2.0 there, and we'll define a client. So you can see here that we already have a client defined here with 2 client count, and these 2 are the client configurations. One can go to this create server description to first tell Iris who is the issuer of credentials, the client ID and client secret, what we also have for Iris from Azure. And once you define them, you can see here, I put the issuer endpoint and an SSL TLS configuration. And once you click on discover and save, it automatically contacts to Azure and discovers all the endpoints and details it would need later. So these are the metadata that's given by Azure to it, because we had added the issuer endpoint there, and it could go and contact that endpoint and collect all these details and save it there for us. So yeah, that's how we have defined our OAuth server description here. And once we have the server description ready, we can go and define our client configurations for our resource server. In our case, this is library API. If we go inside that, we just provide a name to it and then choose the SSL TLS configuration. And you can see there is a resource server button there. And here you can see I'm putting the client ID and client secret given by Azure for library API, what I registered there. So let me quickly go here into library API and show to you that this is exactly the client ID, what is present in the iris. And this is the client secret value starting with AOK that you basically see here in the client configuration. So this is how we create the client configuration here. And so now Iris is also aware of the place where it gets its data from, access token from, and it can also identify itself when it goes to validate the access token received by Postman in front of Azure. So here, this is the last part of this connection, that once you have enabled a delegated authentication in your REST endpoint on REST application, then you need to go and define a Z-authenticate routine which stays in your sys namespace. And this routine gets triggered whenever there is a call to a delegated authentication enabled REST application in Iris. So here is this %sys namespace where you would put your Z-authenticate routine. And let's see what happens here. You can see we are setting some roles which we want to provide to the user once the access token given by the client is right. Here you can see we are defining the name of the application, which is library API, which we had defined here in Iris. And currently the login successful flag is 0. So now we need to actually access the access token or retrieve the access token from the incoming request. And once we have this access token, we have to perform certain operations to find out if this token was correct. So we are setting up the application name as library API, and then here we are defining some expected values that should come in the access token from Postman. So we say that, hey, if someone tells that the scope of this token is scope 2, and the audience of this token is the library API, which we have defined here as our resource server, then we can say that, yes, the access token is intended for the right use. So what we do here is you can see that there is a method validate JWT where we pass our application name, the access token that we received, and the expected scope and audience, what we have defined here. And we can quickly go to this method because there we can see what it does internally. Here you can see that receives the application name, access token, audience, scope, everything. And then it basically currently says that validation is 0 or false. And then it first opens using the application name, the client. So it finds the client and then it converts the JWT access token to an object, and finally it verifies the audience, expected audience, and the audience key in the access token object. If it's fine, then it goes ahead to validate if the access token has expired by accessing the expiry key or value from access token. And then it also compares the scope which has come in the access token with the scope what we are expecting here, basically scope 2. And once these things are done, it sets its valid flag to be 1, and our Z authenticate routine here finds valid to be 1. And if it's valid, then we set the login successful flag as 1. And we also set the rules which we had defined initially to the user so that it can access now the data it intended to access. Now we can finally go back to our Postman, and here we can see what happens if we go and obtain a new access token and use this token here in the Postman, and then use this token to send a request to the endpoint. And we can here see that our request was successful and the data of the cars was retrieved successfully. So that was a quick demo on how to configure your client application, your resource server on Azure, and then how to perform a complete flow of authorization and authentication using OAuth 2.0. And I hope I was able to put some light into it and you guys were able to follow it. And I'll be open for questions. You can also note the email address here where you can send me queries regarding your implementation problem and issues, and I'll try my best to answer those queries and support you. Thank you for coming and participating in my demo and presentation. Over to you, Uwe.
Ja, vielen Dank, Shubham, für deine Erläuterung. Wir haben dank dir unterschiedliche Authentifizierungsmethoden, im Besonderen eben OAuth 2.0 kennengelernt und erfahren, wie diese sich in InterSystems Iris optimal implementieren lassen. Du hast uns zudem aufgezeigt, wie Autorisierungsdienste von Drittanbietern mit InterSystems Iris genutzt werden können. Und ich als Laie muss sagen, das sah jetzt nicht so schwierig aus. Also von daher bin ich mal gespannt, ob wir denn Fragen unserer Zuhörerinnen und Zuhörer beantworten können. Also wenn du bereit bist, Shubham, dann schaue ich mal eben in das Panel rein. Gut, also 2, 3 Fragen gibt's. Die erste Frage, Shubham, das, was du gerade gezeigt hast, ist das spezifisch für Microsoft Azure? Und was muss man tun, wenn man andere Cloud-Dienste wie AWS oder eben Google in ähnlicher Weise nutzen möchte?
Yeah, so as I said in the beginning of the presentation, that OAuth 2.0 is a protocol, and that is very much platform agnostic. So normally the platforms like cloud providers like Azure or Google or AWS implement this flow, excuse me, implements this flow, OAuth flow, and that's why the idea or the communication method and the disciplines and the steps mostly remain the same. So it's very easy to understand the idea here and then take this idea and implement into your choice of cloud providers or identity management providers.
Okay, danke dir. Die nächste Frage beschäftigt sich mit mit der Demo. In der Demo hast du eine REST-Application abgesichert. Kann man in ähnlicher Form auch CSP-Applikationen absichern, Shubham?
Yes, definitely. I mean, most of as I said, the flow stays the same. And I would actually invite our audience, our guests, to also participate into another webinar from one of our colleagues, where he will show exactly this, that how do you secure CSP applications with OAuth 2.0.
Das macht Andreas Schütz später im Jahr, wenn ich es richtig in Erinnerung habe. Danke für den Hinweis, Shubham. Hier ist noch eine interessante Frage. Ich versuche die jetzt mal eben schnell zu übersetzen. In this presentation, you used InterSystems Iris as a resource server and Microsoft Azure's Entra ID as our authentication server. And the question is, can one use InterSystems Iris as an OAuth 2.0 server as well?
Yes, definitely. So Iris has capability of being all of these three actors. For example, authorization server or resource server, or also to be client. So yes, we have the process where you could define or create Iris as your authorization server.
Ja, das klingt gut. Ich sehe jetzt ehrlich gesagt keine weiteren Fragen im Chat, aber ich habe noch eine Frage, Shubham. Als du deine Demo begonnen hast, relativ am Anfang, musstest du dein Handy benutzen, um dich zu authentifizieren, also eine Multi-Factor Authentication. Muss man sowas spezifisch einrichten? Ja, wie?
Yes, so yes, either you could choose to not have it, and then you don't have multi-factor authentication, or you could explicitly go, for example, if you used Iris, then you can go there and configure your multi-factor authorization. And the same goes with these popular cloud services. For example, Azure, when you create an client, register there, and you start logging in, it lets you in without any multi-factor authentication for, I don't remember the exact date, but should be 15 days. But then it kinds of starts telling you that, hey, you need to you need to come up with a multi-factor authentication in place. So yeah, many of them have it by default, or you could opt out of it, or you could have it explicitly.
Prima. Shubham, wenn es dazu oder zu anderen Themenstellungen dieses Webinars im Nachgang Fragen gibt, du hattest ja vorhin deine E-Mail-Adresse netterweise eingeblendet, stehst du ja sicherlich für entsprechende Fragen zur Verfügung. Ich sehe nämlich im Moment keine weiteren Fragen mehr. Damit bedanke ich mich bei allen Teilnehmerinnen und Teilnehmern für die Aufmerksamkeit und natürlich besonders bei dir, Shubham, für deine Ausführungen. Wie ich eben schon sagte, im Nachgang stehen wir Ihnen natürlich wie immer für weitere Informationen oder Fragen sehr gern zur Verfügung. Wenden Sie sich einfach an Ihre bekannten InterSystems Ansprechpartner oder schreiben Sie uns eine E-Mail an info@intersystems.com. Wir stellen dann sicher, dass die Frage den Shubham erreicht. Ja, damit sind wir am Ende unseres heutigen Webinars und ja, Ihnen allen ganz herzlichen Dank für Ihre Zeit und für die Aufmerksamkeit. Wir hatten es eben schon kurz angesprochen, die Webinarreihe InterSystems TechTalk geht natürlich weiter und am 29. Oktober wird unser Referent Andreas Stütz die Nutzung von VS Code ein bisschen beleuchten und uns näher bringen. Wir würden uns sehr freuen, wenn Sie dann Ende diesen Monats wieder mit von der Partie sind. In diesem Sinne, alles Gute, bleiben Sie uns wohlgesonnen, vor allem aber bleiben Sie alle gesund. Auf Wiederhören. Tschüss, Shubham.
Tschüss.